Frank Cole found her. After 20 years of silence, the copper ring he made as a 16-year-old orphan led him back to Natalie Wright. She moved into his Manhattan penthouse. He crafted a second ring with his own hands, cutting his fingers just like before. She wore both rings now, the old one worn smooth by time, the new one clumsy but full of meaning. But finding someone is not the same as keeping them. When the past resurfaces and the world begins to watch, love becomes a question neither of them knows how to answer. 6 months had passed since Natalie moved into the Manhattan penthouse, and the space had transformed in ways Frank never anticipated. Her potted plants lined every windowsill, their green leaves catching the morning light. The sterile perfection he once demanded had given way to something warmer. Throw blankets on the couch, books stacked on end tables, the constant aroma of home-cooked meals drifting from the kitchen. Frank had kept his promise to change. He delegated more responsibilities, left the office before sunset, and learned to sit in comfortable silence beside the woman he had spent 20 years trying to forget. Most evenings they would share dinner on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker on below them like scattered diamonds. Natalie still wore both copper rings, the original one worn smooth by 2 decades of faithful keeping, and the new one Frank had made with his own hands, its craftsmanship imperfect but honest. To anyone looking in, they had found their happy ending. But beneath the surface of this peaceful life, invisible fractures were spreading. Frank noticed it first in the small things. Whenever his assistant called about a charity gala or a business dinner, Natalie would find reasons to decline. She claimed she was not ready, that she needed more time. But Frank recognized the look in her eyes. It was not hesitation. It was fear. The same fear he had seen in the orphanage whenever the older children gathered in groups and Natalie would shrink into the shadows to avoid their notice. He tried to accommodate her. He stopped mentioning the events altogether, started declining invitations himself. He told himself he was being considerate, protective. But late at night, when he could not sleep, a disturbing thought crept in. He was hiding her. Just as he had hidden his own past for 20 years, he was now keeping Natalie separate from his world, as if she were something to be ashamed of. They never talked about the future. No mention of marriage, no discussion of what came next. They existed in a carefully constructed present tense, afraid that naming their relationship might somehow break it. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning. Frank was reviewing quarterly reports when David, his assistant, knocked on his office door with an unusual expression, something between concern and barely contained alarm. "Sir, there is something you need to see." David placed a tablet on Frank's desk. The screen displayed the homepage of the New York Tribune, and the headline hit Frank like a punch to the chest: "Frank Cole, the billionaire and the buried orphan, passed." The article was thorough. An investigative journalist named Marcus Webb had spent months tracing Frank's history, pulling at threads Frank thought he had severed long ago. The piece detailed everything: his original nameless status at St. Catherine's Orphanage in Baltimore, his adoption by the Morrison family, his subsequent name changed to Cole. There were photographs, the orphanage's crumbling facade, old records with his childhood fingerprints, interviews with former staff members who remembered a quiet, determined boy who disappeared one day and never looked back. Frank read every word in silence. 20 years of careful construction. 20 years of burying the boy from St. Catherine's so deep that even Frank himself had almost forgotten he existed. And now, in 3,000 words, Marcus Webb had excavated everything. He did not go home that night until well past midnight. When he finally walked through the penthouse door, Natalie was waiting in the living room, her face illuminated by the glow of her laptop screen. She had read the article, too. Neither of them spoke. Frank sat beside her on the couch, and they stayed like that until dawn, shoulders touching, preparing for whatever came next. What came next was worse. Marcus Webb was not satisfied with one revelation. He continued digging, visiting St. Catherine's in person, interviewing anyone who remembered those years. And somewhere in his investigation, He found another thread, one that led directly to Natalie. The second article dropped exactly 1 week after the first. Frank's phone exploded with notifications before he even finished his morning coffee. He did not need to read the headline to know what had happened. The look on David's face told him everything. Fairy tale or fraud billionaire. Frank Cole and his former maid from the orphanage. This time the details were even more damaging. Marcus Webb had connected the dots that Frank had prayed would remain separate. Natalie Wright, currently residing with the billionaire, had been employed as his housekeeper just months before their relationship became public. She was also from St. Catherine's, the same orphanage, the same years. The article painted two possible narratives and let readers choose either this was the most romantic coincidence in modern history, or it was an elaborate scheme by a former servant to secure her future. Social media erupted within hours. The story spread across platforms like wildfire, each share adding new speculation, new cruelty. Some people called it beautiful, a love story that transcended class and time, but others were vicious. They called Natalie a gold digger, a con artist, a woman who had calculated her way into a billionaire's bed. They dissected her appearance, her background, her worthiness. They questioned every aspect of her existence. Frank found Natalie in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of their bed with her phone in her hands. The screen showed a comment section filled with hundreds of messages, most of them ugly beyond measure. "Stop reading those." His voice came out harsher than he intended. Natalie looked up at him, and for the first time since she had moved in, Frank saw something break behind her eyes. "They think I planned this," she said quietly. "They think I took the job just to get to you, that the ring, the orphanage, all of it, they think it was a trap." Frank took the phone from her hands and set it face down on the nightstand. "Let them think whatever they want. We know the truth." But even as he said it, he understood that the truth had become irrelevant. In the court of public opinion, narrative was everything, and someone had already written theirs. His board of directors called an emergency meeting the following morning. The company's stock had dipped 3% overnight, not catastrophic, but enough to make investors nervous. Partners were asking questions. A major acquisition that had been in negotiations for months was suddenly under review. Frank sat at the head of the conference table facing 12 men and women who had never questioned his judgment until now. "The situation needs to be managed," said Richard Hayes, the oldest board member and the one least afraid to speak bluntly. "Your personal life is affecting shareholder confidence. We need a clear statement either confirming that this relationship is a misunderstanding or—" He did not finish the sentence, but Frank understood. Or ending it. Frank looked around the table at the faces that had once regarded him with respect, bordering on fear. These were people who had watched him destroy competitors, negotiate impossible deals, build an empire through sheer force of will. And now they were asking him to sacrifice the only person who had ever made him feel human. "Schedule a press conference," Frank said. "Tomorrow afternoon." The next day, Frank stood behind a podium bristling with microphones facing a room packed with journalists and cameras. His PR team had prepared a statement carefully worded, legally vetted, designed to distance him from the controversy without explicitly throwing Natalie under the bus. He had memorized every word of it. He did not use a single one. "I am not here to explain or apologize." Frank began, his voice steady. "I am here to tell you the truth, not because I owe it to you, but because the woman I love deserves to have it spoken out loud." The room went silent. "Natalie Wright is not my former maid. She is not a gold digger or a con artist or whatever other names you have invented for her. She is the girl who kept a copper ring I made for her when we were children in an orphanage, and she kept it for 20 years, even though I gave her every reason to throw it away." His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "I was the one who abandoned her. I was the one who broke my promise. And when life brought her back to me, she could have demanded explanations, apologies, reparations. Instead, she gave me something I did not deserve a second chance." Frank gripped the edges of the podium. "So, if you want to judge someone, judge me. I am the billionaire who forgot where he came from. I am the coward who spent 20 years running from his past. Natalie is the only honest person in this story, and I will not allow anyone to turn her into a villain just because loving me made her visible. He stepped back from the microphone and walked out of the room without taking questions. Miles away in the Manhattan penthouse, Natalie watched the press conference on the living room television. Tears streamed down her face as Frank's words echoed through the empty space. He had chosen her, publicly, irrevocably, with the whole world watching. But even as her heart swelled with a love, she had never dared to fully trust a cold voice whispered in the back of her mind. This is only the beginning. The real storm had not yet arrived, and when it did, she was not sure either of them would survive it. The press conference bought them exactly 3 days of peace. For 72 hours, the narrative shifted in Frank's favor. Headlines praised his emotional defense of Natalie. Social media flooded with supportive messages calling their story a modern fairy tale. Opinion pieces debated whether Frank Cole had revealed a more human side of billionaire culture. But the internet has a short memory and an endless appetite for destruction. By the end of the week, the paparazzi had found the penthouse. They camped outside the building's entrance, their cameras clicking like hungry insects whenever anyone entered or exited. Building security tripled, but it was not enough. Telephoto lenses caught Natalie through windows she had thought were private. Drones buzzed near the balcony where she used to water her plants. She stopped going outside. At first, Frank thought it was temporary, a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. He assured her that interest would fade, that the media would find a new target, that they just needed to wait out the storm. He hired additional security. He had blackout curtains installed. He arranged for groceries to be delivered through a private service entrance. But Natalie did not recover. She stopped cooking, stopped reading, stopped caring for the plants that had once filled every corner of the penthouse with life. The green leaves began to yellow and curl at the edges, and she did not seem to notice. She spent hours on her phone scrolling through comment sections with the compulsive focus of someone picking at a wound. Frank found her one evening sitting in the darkened living room, her face lit only by the glow of her screen. He sat beside her and gently took the phone from her hands. The page was filled with comments beneath yet another article about them. Most were cruel. Some were obscene. A few were threats. "You need to stop reading these," he said softly. "These people do not know you." Natalie did not look at him. Her voice came out flat, almost mechanical. "It took me 20 years to believe I was not invisible. 20 years to convince myself that I was worth something, that I deserved to take up space in the world." She finally turned to face him, and the emptiness in her eyes made his chest constrict. "It only took them 2 weeks to remind me that I was wrong." Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. But for the first time since they had reunited, his embrace felt inadequate. He could protect her from cameras and reporters and legal threats. He could not protect her from the voice inside her own head, the one that had whispered she was worthless since childhood, the one that these strangers had somehow reawakened. The distance between them grew slowly, measured not in arguments, but in silences. Natalie smiled less. She retreated to the bedroom earlier each evening. When Frank reached for her in the night, she would accept his touch, but not return it lying still beside him like someone enduring rather than enjoying. One night she finally gave voice to what had been building between them. They were sitting on the couch after dinner, a meal Frank had ordered from a restaurant because Natalie no longer had the energy to cook. The television played softly in the background, some news program neither of them was watching. "I love you, Frank." Her words came suddenly cutting through the ambient noise. "I have loved you since I was 14 years old, and you stood between me and the boys who wanted to hurt me. I loved you when you left without saying goodbye. I loved you for 20 years while wearing a copper ring and telling myself I was foolish, and I love you now." Frank turned to her, hope and dread warring in his chest. "Then why does it feel like you are saying goodbye?" Natalie looked down at her hands at the 2 copper rings that still circled her finger. "Because I am terrified that if I stay in your world, I will disappear. Not the way I was invisible before. That was different. That was survival. This is erasure. Every day I feel pieces of myself being stripped away and replaced with something else. Frank Cole's girlfriend, the orphan who got lucky, the maid who married up." She shook her head slowly. "I do not know who Natalie is anymore. And I am afraid that if I stay, I never will." Frank wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that she was still Natalie, would always be Natalie, that no amount of public scrutiny could change who she fundamentally was. But the words died in his throat, because he recognized the truth in what she was saying. He had watched it happen, watched the woman who had filled his sterile penthouse with life slowly retreat into herself, watched her light dim week by week. His love was hurting her. His presence in her life was causing her pain. The question was no longer whether they could be together. The question was whether being together was good for either of them. Frank made a decision. 3 days later, he walked into a meeting with Harrison Grant, the CEO of a competing real estate firm. They had been negotiating a merger worth $2 billion a deal that would cement Frank's position as the most powerful developer on the East Coast. The papers were ready to sign. Both legal teams had approved the terms. It was the culmination of 18 months of careful maneuvering. Harrison slid the contract across the table with a practiced smile. "Before we finalize, there is one small matter we should discuss." His tone was casual, but his eyes were calculating. "This situation with your personal life, it is creating uncertainty among our investors. Nothing that cannot be managed, of course, but it would help tremendously if you could simplify things." Frank understood exactly what he meant. "You want me to leave Natalie?" Harrison's smile did not waver. "I want you to demonstrate that your judgment has not been compromised. Surely you can understand how this looks. A billionaire and his former housekeeper. The optics are problematic." Frank looked at the contract, $2 billion in neat black ink, the prize he had been working toward for nearly 2 years. Then he looked at Harrison Grant with his expensive suit and his carefully neutral expression and his absolute certainty that everyone had a price. "The optics," Frank repeated slowly. He picked up the contract, studied it for a moment, then tore it cleanly in half. "You can keep your deal." He walked out of the room without looking back. The news broke before he even reached his car. Frank Cole had sabotaged the biggest merger in the company's history. Stock prices plummeted 8% by the end of the trading day. Financial analysts speculated about instability, poor judgment, a billionaire in the grip of a midlife crisis. The board of directors demanded an explanation. Investors called emergency meetings. Frank ignored all of it. He went home to Natalie expecting that his sacrifice would mean something, that proving he valued her more than his empire would somehow bridge the distance between them. Instead, it made everything worse. Natalie watched the news coverage with growing horror. She saw the stock prices fall. She read the articles questioning Frank's sanity. She understood with painful clarity exactly what he had given up for her. "You should not have done that," she said when he came through the door. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Frank crossed the room and took her hands. "I would do it again. 1,000 times." But Natalie pulled away from him, her expression anguished. "Do you not see now I am the reason your company is failing? I am the reason your partners are abandoning you. Every point that stock drops, every deal that falls through, that is my fault. That is what loving me costs." She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold her body together. "What happens in 5 years when you have lost everything? What happens when you look at me and realize I was not worth it? I cannot live with that, Frank. I cannot be the thing that destroyed you." Frank tried to reach for her again, but she stepped back, maintaining the distance between them like a barrier she needed to survive. "I love you," she said, and the word sounded like a wound. "But I think loving you is going to break both of us." They slept in the same bed that night but did not touch. The space between them felt as vast as the 20 years they had spent apart. She became pregnant. The baby was born premature at 6 months and did not survive. The perpetrator was quietly dismissed. No charges were ever filed. The records were sealed and Natalie was left to carry the weight alone. She had never told anyone. Not the counselors at St. Catherine's, not the family she later worked for, not even Frank. It was a wound she had buried so deep that she had almost convinced herself it belonged to someone else, a different girl in a different life. Now the whole world knew. Frank found out the same way everyone else did, through a notification on his phone. He read the article in his office, his hands shaking so badly he could barely scroll through the text. By the time he finished, tears were streaming down his face. He understood now. The fear in her eyes whenever intimacy moved too quickly. The way she flinched at unexpected touch. The walls she had built around herself so high and so thick that even love could not fully penetrate them. She had been carrying this for 21 years, and he had never known. He drove home, breaking every speed limit, desperate to reach her, to hold her, to tell her that none of this changed anything. But when he burst through the penthouse door, Natalie was already packing. Her suitcase lay open on the bed, half filled with the modest clothes she had brought from her old apartment. She moved mechanically, folding each item with careful precision, as if the act of organization could impose order on the chaos consuming her. "Natalie?" Frank's voice cracked on her name. She did not turn around. "I have to go." "No, please. We can get through this together." Now she turned, and the look on her face stopped him cold. It was not anger or grief, or even despair. It was emptiness, the expression of someone who had already left, even though her body remained. "I am not leaving because of you," she said quietly. "I am leaving because of me. I need to look at myself without you standing beside me. I need to figure out who I am when no one is watching." She walked to the nightstand and slowly slipped both copper rings from her finger. Her hand looked bare, almost unrecognizable without them. She placed the rings beside an envelope she had prepared, the metal catching the fading light from the window. "Keep these safe," she said, her voice barely steady. "Both of them." Frank stared at the rings, the original one worn smooth by 20 years of faithful keeping, and the newer one he had made with his own hands. Seeing them separated from her felt like watching a part of her die. "I love you," she said. "That is the only thing I know for certain anymore, but right now I do not know who I am. I have been running from my past for so long, and it finally caught up. I have to face it alone. Not because you are not enough, but because this is my fight." Frank clutched the envelope like a lifeline. "Tell me what to do. Tell me how to help." Natalie reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "Do not look for me. Do not wait for me. Live your life." She attempted a smile, but it faltered. "If I become strong enough, I will come back. But I cannot promise. I have seen what promises do to people." She picked up her suitcase and walked past him through the living room filled with dying plants, past the windows that overlooked a city that had never felt like hers. Frank did not follow. He stood frozen in the bedroom, listening to her footsteps fade, listening to the front door open and close, listening to the silence that remained. When he finally opened the envelope, he found a single sheet of paper with her handwriting, "You made me feel worth bleeding for." That was the greatest gift anyone ever gave me. Now I need to learn to feel that way about myself. Keep the rings safe, both of them. If I find my way back, I will want them waiting. Natalie vanished into the night, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and 21 years of pain she could no longer outrun. And Frank Cole, the man who controlled an empire, stood alone in his penthouse and wept for the second time in his adult life. The first time had been the day he left St. Catherine's without saying goodbye. Frank honored her request. He did not search for her. He did not hire investigators or trace her phone or use any of the countless resources at his disposal to find her. He had lost her once before by taking the easy path by choosing escape over commitment. He would not make that mistake again, even if honoring her wishes felt like slowly bleeding to death. The penthouse became a mausoleum. Natalie's plants continued their slow decline, leaves browning and dropping to the floor. Frank could not bring himself to throw them away, nor could he summon the will to save them. He watered them occasionally mechanically, but without the attention they needed. They died one by one, and each withered stem felt like another piece of her disappearing. He went to work. He attended meetings. He signed documents and made decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. But he moved through his days like a man walking underwater, present in body, absent in everything else. His board of directors noticed the change. His competitors sensed weakness. The stock price stabilized but did not recover. None of it mattered to Frank. He had spent his entire adult life building an empire to prove he was worth something, and now he understood that all of it together weighed less than one copper ring. He kept both rings in a small wooden box on his nightstand. Every night before sleep, he would open the box and look at them, the original one worn smooth by 2 decades of faithful keeping, and the newer one he had crafted with his own clumsy hands. Sometimes he would hold them, feeling their weight, remembering the girl who had torn her shirt to bandage his bleeding fingers, remembering the woman who had walked away rather than watch him destroy himself for her. The first month was the hardest. Frank would catch himself reaching for his phone to call her, typing her name into search engines, driving past the Brooklyn neighborhood where she used to live. Each time he stopped himself. Each time it felt like tearing open a wound that had not yet begun to heal. The second month, he started having the nightmares again. He would wake in the darkness, gasping, reaching for someone who was not there. The ceiling of his bedroom became as familiar as it had been during those sleepless years before Natalie returned, before she filled his empty spaces with green leaves and home-cooked meals, and the simple miracle of her presence. By the third month, Frank realized something that changed everything. He could not save himself by waiting for Natalie to return. If he spent the rest of his life frozen in grief, he would become exactly the man who had abandoned her 20 years ago, someone who existed only in relation to others, who had never learned to face his own reflection. He started therapy. It was the hardest thing Frank Cole had ever done. Harder than building an empire. Harder than tearing up a $2 billion contract. Harder than watching the woman he loved walk out his door. Sitting in that quiet office, facing a stranger who asked questions he had spent a lifetime avoiding, Frank finally began to excavate the boy he had buried. He talked about St. Catherine's, about the hunger and the fear and the desperate desire to escape, about the Morrisons who had given him everything except permission to be himself, about the name. Changes first Morrison, then Cole, each one, an attempt to become someone new, someone untouchable, someone who had never been a nameless orphan in a crumbling building in Baltimore. He talked about Natalie, about the promise he had made and broken, about the guilt that had festered for 2 decades, transforming into a coldness that kept everyone at arm's length, about how finding her again had cracked open something inside him and how losing her had finally shattered it completely. The therapist listened. She asked questions. She did not judge. Slowly, session by session, Frank began to reassemble the pieces of himself into something more honest. 6 months after Natalie left, Frank drove to Baltimore. The St. Catherine's orphanage had closed years ago. The building stood abandoned, now its windows boarded, its walls covered in graffiti, its chain-link fence rusted and sagging. Frank parked across the street and sat in his car for nearly an hour just looking. Finally, he got out and walked to the gate. The padlock was broken, the chain hanging loose. He pushed through and crossed the overgrown courtyard, his expensive shoes sinking into mud that had once been a concrete pathway. The fire escape was still there, the rusted metal stairs where he and Natalie used to sit on warm nights, dreaming of futures that seemed impossibly far away. Frank climbed to the second-floor landing and sat on the corroded grating, his legs dangling over the edge, just like they had when he was 16 years old. And for the first time since childhood, Frank allowed himself to grieve. He wept for the boy he had abandoned, for the promises he had broken, for the man he had become, and the man he should have been. He wept until his chest ached and his throat was raw, and somewhere in that release, something shifted. He could not change the past, but he could decide what the future would mean. 3 months later, Frank established the Glass Ring Foundation. It provided support for orphans aging out of the foster system and resources for survivors of institutional abuse. He did not hold a press conference. He did not put his name on the building. He simply did it because it was right, because he finally understood that redemption was not about grand gestures witnessed by the world, but about quiet choices made when no one was watching. Across the river in Brooklyn, Natalie was fighting her own battle. She had returned to her old apartment, the lease still valid, because she had never officially terminated it. The space was small and bare, stripped of the plants she had taken to Frank's penthouse and never brought back. She slept on a mattress on the floor and ate simple meals and tried to remember who she had been before the world started watching. The first week, she did not leave the apartment at all. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling the full weight of everything she had been running from for 21 years. The memories she had buried so deep came flooding back, the staff member at St. Catherine's who had cornered her in the storage room, the months of terror and shame, the baby who had lived for only a few hours before slipping away. For the first time in her life, Natalie let herself feel it all. She did not push the pain away or pretend it belonged to someone else. She simply lay in the darkness and let it wash over her wave after wave until she thought she might drown. But she did not drown. She survived. And after the worst had passed, she picked up the phone and made an appointment with a therapist. The sessions were excruciating. Speaking the words aloud, describing what had happened to her, naming the baby she had lost, acknowledging the shame she had carried for more than 2 decades, felt like pulling glass shards from wounds that had never properly healed. But with each session, the glass came out a little more and the wounds began to close. Her therapist taught her something that changed everything. She did not need anyone to love her in order to be worthy of love. Her value did not depend on Frank's affection or the world's approval or the absence of trauma in her past. She existed. That was enough. It took months, but slowly Natalie began to rebuild herself, not the version of herself that had served wealthy families without being seen, and not the version that had tried to fit into Frank's world. Someone new. Someone who could stand in the light without disappearing. 1 year after she walked out of Frank's penthouse, Natalie sat by her window in the Brooklyn apartment watching the afternoon sun paint the walls gold. On the table before her was a single sheet of paper and an envelope. She thought about the 2 copper rings she had left with Frank, the original one he had made when they were children, and the newer one he had crafted as a man who had learned to change. She had asked him to keep them safe, and she knew he had. She picked up her pen and began to write. Frank, I am not the same person who left your penthouse a year ago. I do not know if that is good or bad. I only know that I am finally learning to look at myself without flinching. The rings are yours to keep, both of them. The first one belongs to the children we used to be. The second one belongs to the people we might still become. I am not ready to come back. I do not know when I will be. But I wanted you to know that I am still here, I am still healing, and I have not forgotten. When I am strong enough, I will come for them. Wait for me, or do not. That choice is yours. But know that I am trying, and that has to be enough for now. She sealed the envelope and addressed it to his office. Then she walked to the corner mailbox and sent it before she could change her mind. 3 days later, Frank found the envelope among his morning correspondence. There was no return address, but he recognized her handwriting immediately. The same neat letters that had filled the note she left the night she walked away. He read her words once, twice, 3 times. Then he walked to his nightstand, opened the wooden box, and looked at the 2 copper rings waiting inside. She was alive. She was healing. She had not forgotten. Frank lifted the 2nd ring, the one he had made with his own hands, the one that represented not who they had been, but who they could become, and carried it to his desk. He placed it in the top drawer, where he would see it every morning when he began his work. Then he walked to the balcony where Natalie's plants had finally been replaced with new ones green and thriving under his inexpert care. He looked out across the Manhattan skyline toward Brooklyn, toward a small apartment where a woman was learning to believe she deserved to be loved. And for the first time in a year, Frank Cole smiled. The question hung in the air between them, spanning the miles and the silence. When 2 people have finally learned to love themselves, is there still room for them to love each other? Neither of them knew the answer. But for the first time, not knowing felt like hope instead of fear. This story teaches us something important. Sometimes love is not about staying together at all costs. Sometimes the bravest thing 2 people can do is step apart. Not because they have stopped loving each other, but because they need to learn how to love themselves first. Frank spent 20 years running from his past. Natalie spent 21 years burying her pain. It was only when they faced those wounds alone that they began to truly heal. And here is the question I want to leave with you. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved, not because the love was gone, but because you needed to find yourself? Or maybe someone walked away from you and you are still waiting, still hoping, still wondering if they will return. Share your story in the comments. You might be surprised how many people understand exactly what you are going through. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Part 3 is coming, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens when Natalie finally decides whether to reach for those rings again. Will she go back to Frank? Will he still be waiting? Or have they both changed too much to find their way back to each other? Until next time, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, some stories take time to unfold. The best ones are worth waiting for.